Traveling is one of the most exciting and rewarding things that we can do as photographers. And I think for many of us, it's one of the key reasons why we got into photography in the first place. But there's also a lot that goes into the travel photography process, from knowing what gear to bring along to location scouting, planning your trip, and of course, what to actually do when you get there. So in this video, I want to share some of the things that I've learned over the last 10 years of travel photography, not just about gear and logistics, but also about how to actually approach your photography when you get to your destination so you can have a better experience and walk away with more interesting images. And first up is be okay with missing shots. And this really all comes down to one thing, and that is bringing less gear. And when I first started out with travel photography, I had to bring all of my gear with me when I went out traveling. I'd bring several zoom lenses, a couple prime lenses, multiple bodies, a drone. And over the years, I realized not only was my back hurting more, but also just dealing with the stress of carrying so much gear with you on international travel and flying with it and dealing with that whole process distracted me from the most important thing in travel photography, which is enjoying my time there and walking away with images that I was proud of. And over the years, I've really started to take less gear when I'm traveling, and it's made my trips so much more fulfilling and so much more interesting. A lot of the time, you can capture that image with one camera and one lens. You don't need the best of the best in every scenario. And yes, there are going to be situations where you're going to miss that shot because you didn't have the right lens with you. But I would argue that all the time that you saved not changing lenses and not carrying around a super heavy backpack will actually result in more better photos throughout the trip. So you really don't need to carry all the best gear with you. A lot of the time, a single zoom lens and maybe one prime lens is more than enough to capture what you need. And I used to always go out with a 70-200, and now that's a lens that I don't bring because I found that I was only using it maybe a few times during my trip, and most of the time I was shooting with my 24-70 and my 35mm prime. So yes, the gist of this tip is bring less gear on your trip, but I think you first have to come to terms with the fact that you're not going to be able to shoot every variation of every composition with all your different lenses. You're much better off with a much simpler, lighter, and streamlined setup. But I would recommend investing in a good travel photography backpack and a good little camera sling as well. That way you're covered if you want to do a more robust shoot where you want to bring all your gear, you have that backpack, and that's also good for traveling and going through the airports. But also if you just want to do some casual street photography, you can use that photography sling as well. And if you want to see all the bags and all the gear that I used, as well as a detailed buying guide for 3 different price points, check out my photography gear guide. I'll put a link down in the description, and I hope you guys enjoy. Now, tip number 2 is something that I've made a concerted effort to do more and more over the last few years. And because of it, I find that my trips are much more interesting. I'm seeing so many more things, and I'm also walking away with much better images as well. And that tip is to connect with other photographers at your destination. Not only does this mean you get to hang out with another photographer and go out and see the city or see the destination with another person, but also it opens the door to so many local insights in that particular destination. So many of my favorite images were taken in places that I wouldn't have known about if I didn't reach out to local photographers who took me there. We went out shooting together, and they introduced me to these locations where I ended up capturing some of my favorite photos. But not only that, I got to hang out with other photographers who knew about the culture, who knew about the location, and also I got to see how they shot as well. And there's always a learning experience in that as well. So when you're planning your trip and you're doing research on your location, I think one of the first things that you can do is head over to Instagram and DM some local photographers in that area and just say, hey, what's up, man? I'm coming out in a couple weeks, or I'm coming out in a few months, and I would love to hang out and maybe do a little bit of shooting with you, grab some coffee, grab a beer, grab dinner, whatever it is. Just making that connection can make your trip so much more interesting and so much more fulfilling. So do yourself a favor and reach out to some local photographers before you get to your location. It's going to make your trip a lot more interesting. Now, this next tip is something that I've discussed here on the channel before, but I think it's even more relevant for travel photography, and that is a beautiful location does not necessarily equal a beautiful photo. One of the biggest mistakes that you can make as a photographer is venturing out to a beautiful location and just assuming you're going to get a good photo there. And sometimes this might work. You might get super lucky with the lighting, you might have the right lens, and you might just walk away with a banger image in some scenarios. But there is so much more that goes into a beautiful photo than just the subject matter and just the location. There's the stylistic elements of photography, like lighting and composition and detail. And there's also the technical side as well, like your lens selection or your camera settings. And all of these factors culminate on what is to be a beautiful photo. And subject matter is only one piece of that puzzle. So if you find yourself shooting in a beautiful location, location while you're traveling, which undoubtedly you will, because a lot of the time we're traveling to see these beautiful locations. Don't be lazy and just rely on the subject matter or the location itself. Be creative and look for interesting ways to photograph that subject. Pay attention to all the stylistic elements of photography in lighting, style, and composition, and know that just because you're in a beautiful location doesn't mean you're going to capture a beautiful photo. And on the flip side of that, just because you're in a boring location doesn't mean you can't capture a beautiful image as well. And some of my favorite images have been taken in pretty boring places that most people would overlook, but I noticed it and I captured that scene in a beautiful way. So in short, a beautiful location does not necessarily equal a beautiful photo. You are in control of that, and you need to interpret that scene and capture it to the best of your ability. Now, this next tip has to do with something that I really struggled with when I just started off with travel photography. And I think a lot of other photographers struggle with this as well. And of course, I'm talking about researching locations that you want to go shoot at when you get to your destination. And I think when a lot of us start out our research for our trip, one of the first things we'll do is go to Instagram or we'll go to Pinterest and we'll search the location that we're going to, and we'll look at some of the photos that we see there. And oftentimes this is a really great way to find some pretty amazing photography locations at that destination. But over time, you'll start to realize that the locations that you're finding are all the same, and all these photographers are just photographing that same composition and regurgitating it in a slightly different style. But because these popular photography locations are so dominant online, it's really hard to find some of these lesser known photography locations, which for me was always really important. I wanted to go somewhere and break new ground and shoot something that other people hadn't shot before. And the truth is, you're not going to be able to find a lot of these lesser known photography locations until you actually show up and start exploring and you get a little bit lost at your destination. So one of the things that I've been doing is going to that popular photography location and just using it as a starting point. At the very least, you capture that composition that everyone else is shooting as well. But 9 times out of 10, I walk away from those situations with unique compositions that nobody has ever shot before. And it all comes down to paying attention to your surroundings and relying on your creativity to find something unique that nobody else sees. And a really good example of this is a photo that I shot in Vermont back in 2018. There's this really popular farm in a small town in Vermont that everyone wants to go photograph in autumn because it's beautiful. It looks amazing, but this composition is absolutely everywhere. Everyone just goes to this farm and shoots the same exact composition. So when I went there, of course, I shot that composition, but I ended up doing a little bit more exploring in that area, and I ended up capturing a few more images that I think are much, much more interesting than that composition that everyone else is shooting. So while you're researching your trip, a lot of the time you're going to come across these really popular photography destinations. It's okay to go there, but use it as a starting point. Don't get tunnel visioned into that one composition that everybody else is shooting, because at the end of the day, if you can capture compositions that no one else has seen before and you can break new ground, that is much more fulfilling than shooting the same composition that everybody else is shooting. And if you're a photographer that wants to completely avoid these popular photography destinations altogether, that's totally fine as well. But I do think we should have at least a general idea of the vibes of some of the locations that we might come across during our travels. And if you guys want to see some of the tools that I use for location scouting on my trips, you can check out my travel photographer's toolkit. I'll put a link down in the description, or you can watch this video here where I go more in depth into planning my trip and scouting out locations for my travels. But planning out a list of potential locations is only one piece of the puzzle when it comes to the planning phase, which is arguably the most important part of our trip and also the part that I hate the most when it comes to traveling. Some of the trips that I go on require a lot of planning, like keeping track of all my flights, accommodation, and also all of my creative ideas for that trip. And that's why tip number 5 is a tool called Milanote that I've been using to plan out all of my trips over the last few years, as well as using it to organize all of my creative projects as a whole. So I was stoked when Milanote reached out and asked to sponsor this video, because I've been genuinely using them for the last few years and I couldn't imagine planning my trips or traveling without them at this point. Now, Milanote is a tool for organizing all of your creative projects, and it's an interactive online canvas that makes it easy to plan, brainstorm, and collaborate on ideas. And it's perfect for creatives like me because it allows you to organize your ideas visually. You can add photos, you can add colors, you can add comments, and you can organize it in a way that makes sense to you. So let me show you guys how I used Milanote to plan out my most recent trip to Japan in November of last year. So this is a project board that I created to plan out our Japan trip. We spent 3 weeks in Japan. We went all over. It was such an epic trip, but there was a lot of planning that I had to do. So as you can see here, I have pretty much everything I need for this trip at one glance. Up here in the left-hand corner, I have trip overview with the dates, the locations, the purpose. I have a general timeline. And also over here, I have my transport details. And what I love about Milanote is I can go ahead and click on my flight details, and it's gonna immediately open up my flight details there for me to view. So I can quickly access that at the airport if I wanted to. I also have a list of photography locations here, which opens up into a Google map, as well as a bunch of checklists here. You can see I have gear to pack, things to do, and you can easily just check those off when you're done. Foods, activities, etc. But one of the things that I love so much about Milanote is I can create really engaging and inspiring mood boards directly in the app. So if I click here on my mood board for Japan, you can see I have a ton of images that I've come across during the planning phase of my trip. And to add these in, it was super easy. You can use the Milanote web clipper. You can go online, find a photo, and easily just add that in, or you can just drag and drop a photo into your board and it'll show up there in the mood board. But I also love that I can add a color palette directly in here as well. Color is a huge part of my photography process, and to add that in, all I have to do is go down here, click on these three dots, grab color, drag that in, and then I can click that color, go up here to the color, click the little dropper tool there, and then I can drag over any part of my image and select a color. And now you have a really cool color palette that you can play around with, just so you have a general idea of some of the colors that you want to chase during your trip. So it's very interactive. You can put things pretty much anywhere on the canvas. And that's one of the things that I love so much about Milanote. Plus, Milanote has over 100 built-in templates available for every type of creative project, including a bunch for photography and videography. So no matter what type of creative you are, there's a template for you to use. And when you're ready to share your work, you can invite your team to gather important feedback and collaborate with them in real time. For example, I shared this board directly with my boss, AKA my girlfriend, and she came in and provided feedback on some of the things that we wanted to do during this trip. Now, if you guys want to sign up to Milanote and try it out, it's free with no time limit. You guys can check it out via the first link in the description. It really has been an incredible tool for me over the last few years, not just for planning my trips, but also keeping all of my creative projects organized in one place. So I was super stoked when Milanote asked to sponsor this video. So thank you, Milanote, once again for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. Now, the next tip on this list is short and sweet, and it's two small pieces of gear that I cannot travel without these days. The first one is air tags. I don't think I need to say a whole lot about these. These are a must-have for every traveler, regardless of whether you're a photographer or not. I can put this in my checked bag so I can track my luggage just in case it gets lost. I can tell the airline where it is. I also put one in my main camera backpack, as well as my camera sling, and in my wallet as well. So if those happen to get stolen while you're traveling, you have a little bit of recourse because you can find it using the AirTag. And the second piece of gear I recommend are step-up rings. Now, I can't show you a step-up ring right now because I'm actually using the one that's on my lens now, but a step-up ring is just a small ring that screws onto the front of your lens to change the filter thread size. And all of my lenses fall between 67mm and 82mm filter threads. So I buy all of my filters at 82mm, and then I just use step-up rings on all of my smaller lenses to make sure that I can put that 82mm filter on all of my lenses. So I don't need to carry multiple versions of the same filter. I just have one, and I use step-up rings to make sure that it fits all of my lenses. Not only is this going to save you money, so you don't have to buy multiple versions of the same type of filter. You only need one ND filter or one polarizing filter, and also it's going to save space while you're traveling as well. So those are two pieces of gear that I think every travel photographer needs to have, and I'll put links down in the description to these products as well. Now, the next tip on this list is to shoot in sets. And I think for a lot of us, when we get to a beautiful location, we'll oftentimes just shoot the first composition that we see, and then we'll move on from that scene and go out and look for something else. But oftentimes there's a lot more to shoot in that particular place. So one of the things that I've started doing over the last few years is to think in sets. When I approach a new location, I'll aim to shoot 6 photos, 2 photos wide, 2 photos mid, and 2 photos tight as well. And why this is so great is because it adds a ton of diversity to our shots. And I've always said that a collection of images is so much more compelling than just a single banger photo. And when you think in sets, it allows you to capture a diverse amount of photos that tell a much more meaningful story about that particular location. And at the end of the day, the story that we're telling through our photos is the most important thing in photography. Yes, it's cool to have beautiful looking images, but images that make you feel something, that tell a deeper story, are going to be much more impactful to the viewer. Another way to think about this is, instead of taking photos of a place, take photos about a place. Focus on the small details, the light spilling in through a window at a cafe, interesting textures that you see, or pops of color that define that location. I did a whole set on the colors of Bangkok because when I was in Bangkok, color was one of the first things that I noticed in that city. It was one of the first things that I felt attached to, and I really wanted to capture that story in a collection of images. So don't just shoot that first composition that you see, hang out and shoot a collection of images because that's going to be much more powerful than just one single photo. Now, the next tip on this list is sunrise is king, but I'm not just saying that sunrise is the only good time to shoot. In fact, I think when you're traveling, you should be shooting at all times of the day. You never really know when a location is going to look its best. And sometimes a location might not look good in the morning, but it could look epic during the harsh midday sun. And on the flip side of that, sometimes a location won't look good in harsh light, but it will look good at sunrise or sunset. So I think it's really important for us to shoot in all types of light while we're traveling. But the reason why I said sunrise is king is because sunrise is a really unique time to experience while you're traveling. And I think a lot of photographers don't have the energy or the willpower to wake up and shoot sunrise, but you get a lot of benefits from waking up before everybody else. You get to see the city or the location without a ton of people walking around, and you get a really close, intimate feeling for that location. Some of my favorite memories are when I wake up super early and I walk around a city and the only people that are awake are the old people that are waking up and starting their day. It's also a really good opportunity to capture compositions with just one single subject instead of having a ton of people walking around your composition. And if you're traveling with somebody else and they don't want to spend all of their time walking around taking photos, this is a good opportunity for you to wake up, shoot a little bit, and then meet up with them for breakfast after they wake up and get ready. So if you're traveling, I highly recommend getting up at sunrise to shoot. Not only are you going to get that beautiful, soft sunrise light, but you're going to be able to experience the streets in a way that you won't be able to a little bit later on in the day. Now, tip number 9 is to shoot in aperture priority. And for all of you manual mode maximists watching this video, just know that most professional photographers aren't shooting in manual mode all the time because there's no real reason to if you're shooting in good light. Aperture priority allows you to set your aperture and the camera will auto select everything else. And if you're shooting in good light, the only thing that really matters in those scenarios is depth of field, which of course is affected by our aperture. And the reason why I put this on this list, it sounds a little bit simple, but when I first started traveling, I remember I didn't bring my camera with me on one of my trips because I didn't want it to consume my trip. It wasn't easy for me to use my camera, and I spent so much time thinking about dialing in the perfect camera settings that it actually pulled me out of my environment, and I felt like I couldn't fully enjoy my trip because of it. But in reality, we don't need to be thinking about all these different things. A lot of the time, aperture is going to have the biggest impact on our images. So I highly recommend shooting in aperture priority. If you feel like using your camera and trying to find the right settings is pulling you out of your environment, it allows you to connect with your scene in a much deeper way. And at the end of the day, the stylistic elements of photography and composition, lighting, storytelling, and detail are much more important than the actual technical settings on your camera. So if you are a manual mode maximist, just know that a lot of the time you really don't need to be shooting in manual mode. And if you are still learning photography and you're not fully versed in your camera settings, it's totally okay to shoot in aperture priority. And if you do want to become fluent with your camera and the exposure triangle, I will put a link to my photography essentials class down in the description. In that class, we cover everything you need to know as a beginner photographer. So once again, the link is in the description. Now, last but most certainly not least on this list is do a little bit of research on the culture and the laws of the place that you're planning to visit. A lot of the time, we're going to be traveling to places that are quite foreign to us, and they might have a culture that directly conflicts with the culture that we grew up with and that we're used to. And I think it's really important for us to have an idea of what to expect when we get to that place, not just from a photography perspective and knowing what's right or wrong and taking photos of people on the streets, but also some of the laws as well, particularly drone laws. Every country has different drone laws, so it's really important that if you do want to fly a drone where you're traveling, make sure you look up the local laws and you get any of the permits that you need ahead of time so you can actually go there and fly your drone. The last thing you want to do is get arrested while you're traveling the world and taking photos. And yes, I have heard of this before. So be careful and make sure you do research on the culture of the place that you're visiting so you can make sure that you're not going to disrespect anybody by not just taking photos, but also just traveling in that place in general. You want to make sure that you can abide by the norms of that place. A good example of this is Japan, that has many many unspoken societal norms that you're expected to follow even if you are a tourist, like not speaking on the train, for example, or not taking photos of people on the train, for example. So these are things that you should really care about and you should look into before your trip, because even though you are a tourist, that doesn't give you the right to be disrespectful to a culture. And I think this is a really important tip for this video. But those are just some of the things that I've learned over the years as a travel photographer. And honestly, this video was hard to put together because I felt like there were so many tips that I could have included, but I didn't want to make an hour-long video. And if you guys think I missed anything super important, let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to check those out and just chat with you guys down below. But thank you guys for watching to the end of this video. And if you guys want to see more of my travel photography videos, I'll put a link to a playlist here, which has a ton of videos that I shot all around the world. And of course, there are many more to come as well. So if you're new here, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss those. But thank you guys once again. And also thank you so much, Milanote, for sponsoring this video. And I will catch you guys very soon in the next one.